Speech at Berlin Super Palace, January 30th, 1940, Adolf Hitler. German comrades, 7 years is a short time span, a fraction of a single person's life, barely a second in the life of a whole people. And yet, the past 7 years somehow seem longer than many decades of the past. A very important historical event is contained within them, the rebirth of a nation formerly threatened by extinction. It is an incredibly eventful time and seems barely comprehensive, sometimes to us who have not just had the opportunity to witness, but also to actually create a small part of it. Democratic ideals are a big topic of discussion right now. Not in Germany, but other parts of the world talk about them. We in Germany have learned our lesson with democratic ideals. If the rest of the world praises these ideals, we can only answer that Germany people had the chance to live within the purest form of this ideal. And we ourselves are now reaping the legacy left by this democracy. We then get a lecture on the wonderful goals of war, especially from the British side. Great Britain has much experience in proclaiming goals of war, considering they have waged more wars than anyone else. The goals they proclaim today are fantastic. The creation of a new Europe. This Europe will be just a place, and the general equality will make arms unnecessary. So we can all disarm. This disarmament is supposed to start a period of economic blossoming. Trade and movement should commence, especially trade, much trade, free trade. And from this trade, culture is supposed to bloom. Not just culture, but religion too. In one phrase, the golden age is supposed to dawn. Unfortunately, this golden age has been described in a very similar fashion on several occasions, and not even by prior generations, but by the same people that are describing it yet again. It is a very worn out groove on an old LP. We should pity these gentlemen who haven't found a new big idea to hook the people on, because they promised the same thing in 1918. The goal of the war then was also a new Europe and a new equality. This new equality whose main element is abolishing a nation's right to self-determination. And at that time, an equality that would make arms unnecessary in the future was disarmament, especially manifest. It was supposed to be crowned by a union of all disarmed states, which had decided that in the future, all differences, at least no one doubted there would still be differences between them, should be, well as it is the custom among democracies, be talked to pieces in open discussion. Under no circumstances should there be any shooting worldwide, any shooting. And at the time, it was already said that the consequences of this disarmament and this worldwide parliament would be an incredible blossoming, a blooming of industry, and especially, and much emphasis is always put on this, of trade, of free trade. Culture as well should not be disregarded in this process. And while one spoke of a little bit less about religion at the end of the war than at the beginning, we at least were told in the year 1918 that it would be a blessed era, that God would smile upon. We are experiencing now what happened then. The old states were dissolved without even asking their people's opinion. Not in one single case was the nation asked if we agreed with the measures that others would put into place in them. Old, almost historical bodies were dissolved. Not just states, but also economic bodies. One cannot imagine something better in their stead, since what is created over a period of several centuries is probably better than anything else. It was definitely impossible for those people that view all of European history with the greatest ignorance to create something better. So it passed that. There was no more talk of disarmament then. On the contrary, the arms race continued, for no one started solving their conflicts in a peaceful manner. On the contrary, those states with arms waged war just like before. Only disarmed were not able to forbid the menacing actions of the armed, or to even keep them away from themselves. Paralleling this, of course, came not a period of economic health, but on the contrary, an incredible system of reparation led to the economic downfall of not only this economic downfall of not only the losers, but also the winners themselves. No people felt that the effects of this economic suppression more than Germans. The general economic disorganization led, particularly in Germany, to widespread joblessness that almost ruined our German people. Culture as well was not enhanced, but rather ridiculed and warped. Religion took a backseat in these 15 years. No one British spoke of religion. No British person remembered Christian mercifulness or altruism. At that time, the gentlemen did not take their Bibles with them on walks. Instead, their Bible was the treachery of Versailles. 448 paragraphs, all of which burden an obligation, a commandment, a blackmail of Germany or towards Germany, of which, and this verse was guaranteed by the new League of Nations, not a union of free nations, of similar nations, not a union of nations at all, a league of nations whose sole task was to guarantee this most of all agreements. This agreements which was not negotiated, but instead purely focused upon us and to force us to fulfill it. So that was a time of a democratic Germany. Today, when foreign statesmen pretend not to be able to trust the modern Germany, it does not apply to the previous Germany. For what was not that the previous Germany birthed and created by them, so they could trust it? And how badly they treated that Germany, who still completely memories of the history of that time, the horrible collapse of 1918, the tragic occurrences of 1919, and then all the years of domestic economic deterioration, the ongoing enslavement and impoverishment of our people, and most of all, the complete hopelessness. Today still is unsettling to think of that time when a great nation slowly lost trust, not just in itself, but in any sort of worldly justice. During this whole time, democratic Germany hoped, begged, and protested in vain. The international financial sector stayed brutally inconsiderate and squeezed as much as it could out of our people. The statesmen of the Allied nations remained hard-hearted. It was merciless, said on the contrary that 20 million Germans were too many. No one listened to the wretchedness of our unemployed. No one cared about the ruin of our agriculture or industry, not even of our trade. We remember the silencing of the traffic that occurred at this time in German Reich. At this time when all hope was gone, when begging was proved to be futile, when protesting did not lead to victory, it was a time that the National Socialist movement was created for one basic insight. The insight that one is not allowed to hope in this world, nor beg, nor lower oneself by protesting. Instead, one needs to help oneself. For 15 years in this democratic Germany, hope was preached. Hope for a new world, for new institutions. Every side had its international patron. Some hoped for the international solicitude of the pro-list. Others placed their hope in democratic international institutions on the League of Nations in Geneva. Still, others hoped for a global conscious, for a culture conscious. All this hope was in vain. We have put a different type of hope in the place of the previous hope. The hope of only help that exists in this world. Help through one's own power. The place that inner values back then, we had very little real tools to help us. What we saw as the building blocks of the new Reich, besides our own will, was firstly our people's manpower. Secondly, the intelligence of our people. And third, that which Liberties has to offer, namely our earth and soil. Thus, we began our work and subsequently witnessed the International Germany accent. This international Germany accent, which did not threaten the rest of the world in any way, which was purely internal German reforms, still insanely managed to produce hate in others. Possibly the most tragic movement of this happening was when we proclaimed our 4-year plan an idea which should have enthused the other world. A people wanted to help itself. It did not appeal to others for aid. It did not appeal for presents, for charity. It appealed to its own creativity, facilities, its own diligence, its own energy, its own intelligence. And still, the other world started shouting. Britain's statesmen cried out, "What do you think you're doing? This four-year plan, it does not fit into our global economy," as if they had let us part in this global economy. No, they sentenced the recovery of German people. And because of this, because we foresaw this, and because we noticed this, we immediately began, parallel to this recovery, to remobilize German power. You know these years, 1933, so the same year in which we took over power, I saw myself forced to withdraw from the League of Nations and to leave the ridiculous conference on disarmament. We could not receive any rights from those two forums, despite years of begging and protesting. 1934, German rearmament began on the grandest scale. In 1935, I instituted the general draft. In 1936, I corrected the situation of the Rhineland. In 1937 was the start of the four-year plan. In 1938, the Ostmark and the student land were aims to the Reich. In 1939, we began to shield the Reich against those enemies that in the meantime had removed their masks. The measures introduced in 1939 were to protect the Reich. All this could have been different if this other world had even for an hour showed understanding for the German claims, for the necessities of life, of German power. So often it is said, we should have negotiated this. You remember, my comrades, did I not know more than one occasion raise the issue of German colonial claims before the world? Did we ever receive an answer to this except for a no? Except for repudiation? Indeed, almost new hostility, no. In Britain and France, the ruling classes were determined to renew their fight against us. The moment preventing Europe to fully consolidate itself, just like France for many years tried so to prevent Germany from full consolidation.